This is a video on logic model diagrams and how we can use them in the Essential platform to enhance both our strategy, planning, and execution, and also our enterprise risk management program. I've logged into a demo account for a fictitious city called the City of Greenboro, and I'm going to go to the strategy console. And within this console, I've got my strategic priority areas, or my strategic categories. They're laid out as horizontal bars. And when I expand them out, I can see my objectives underneath them. Now I've set up high-level objectives, so city level or corporate objectives, and then underneath them I have departmental objectives. So I've cascaded out my strategy down through the various departments in my organization. And I'm going to open one of them here, which is to promote emerging industries in my city. And I'm going to scroll down to the logic model diagram. Now, one of the best practices in strategy is to lay out the logic of how you believe you'll succeed. And that's both at a high-level strategy, so where we choose to compete and how we choose to compete, but it's also at an objective setting level. So if we have plans to achieve an objective and there's outcomes we want to achieve, then we should be surfacing and thinking through and explaining the logic of how we think we're going to get there. And so a logic model is really just a structured analysis tool. It's a diagram that helps us to think through that process. Now, you can set yours up differently and you can use different terminology, but this is a pretty common setup for logic models. They're typically broken into three sections. So we have inputs, outputs, and outcomes. Inputs are the investments that we're making. Outputs are the things that we're doing, as well as who we're doing it with and who we're doing it for. And that often gets called initiatives and participants. And then outcomes, this is what we're hoping to achieve. And they're typically, we would typically identify outcomes in the short, medium, and long term. And so we can use this sort of structured analysis and sort of scenario-based planning to think through the process of how we're going to achieve an outcome or how we're going to affect a change that we want to create. Some people will call these the theory of change, and it's the same idea. As part of doing all of this, we would also identify the assumptions that we're making, and we'd also identify the external factors that could impact our ability to do this. And so hopefully you're seeing how this can help, this type of structured thinking can help to have more rigorous planning around your objectives. It gives you a basis or a way to communicate, to others who you need to work on with this objective. And it also gives you a framework to measure progress and success. What it also does, though, is from an enterprise risk management perspective, if you're going through this thought process, if you're workshopping this, or you're working with the subject matter experts that have thought about this objective, thinking through these components puts you in an excellent position to think about enterprise risks. And if we go back to what the definition of an enterprise risk is, it's an event that might occur, that would have an impact on your ability to achieve your objective. So, enterprise risks can be risks to objectives. They can also be risks that come from pursuing the objective. So if we've just thought through our assumptions and we've thought through our external factors, that's really the perfect time to say, okay, well, what if we're wrong? Or what are things that could change? What are things that, we're counting on? And therefore, what are risks that could occur that would impact our ability to achieve this? And in the Essential system, we make it really easy to add a risk here. So we could add one from our library and attach it to this objective, or we could create a new one and attach it on the fly. Now I've got one that's been created here already, and so I'm going to click through on it. And when I get to the detail screen for this risk, I'm going to scroll down to the bow tie diagram. This is analogous to a logic model, but for a risk. It's a visual analysis tool that helps us to think through a risk. The event we're concerned about goes in the middle. We can map the root causes on the far left, the consequences or impacts of the risk on the far right, and then we can map our controls or mitigations as to whether they're pre-event or post-event. So with pre-event, we're trying to stop the risk event from happening. With post-event, we're assuming, okay, the event has happened. Now, what are the things we can do to lessen the impact and lessen the ultimate consequences? And so, it's another scenario planning, another scenario-based tool where I can see how lots of different scenarios might unfold. And I can also get proactive now to think, okay, maybe there's other mitigations we could be taking, to lessen the potential consequences. But if we think for a moment about these consequences, really these consequences in an enterprise risk context, these are impacts, on our outcomes that we're trying to achieve. So if I go back to my logic model, and I think about these outcomes, those impacts from my risk, this is typically where they're hitting. Okay, and so again, I can kind of go through this cycle of logic model planning, bow tie planning, and I can look for, I can in effect stress test my strategy, and at the same time, find ways that I can perhaps better manage the risk, and therefore, in better managing the risk, have a better, a better chance of achieving this objective, on time and on budget. The other thing that, tying these two together really helps with is risk appetite. If you think about risk appetite, if you're just thinking about it purely from a risk perspective, it's sometimes a little bit hard to conceptualize. But really, if risks are impacting our outcomes, another way to think about appetite is to think about, how much tolerance, do we have in these outcomes being different than what we're planning. So if the impact of the risk is to lessen, the achievement of these outcomes, how much of that can we take before we believe that's too much and we need to do something about it? And so reframing risk appetite as tolerance of outcomes and sort of using these two diagrams in concert, is a really helpful way to think about, our risk appetite, specifically when we're getting down to the level of individual objectives and risks. The other thing that this kind of thinking can help with is when we're trying to identify key risk indicators. Again, if you're just looking at it purely from a risk perspective, sometimes it can be a little bit abstract to think about the metrics you should be tracking. But again, if we think of risks as events that might impact, this logic model, it becomes much clearer, what the metrics are that we should be tracking. And often those metrics will be tied to our outcome. So if there's specific outcomes we're looking for, well, why don't we actually track numbers on those and see, are we progressing the way we expected to? But also, if there's certain assumptions that we're making, or there's certain external factors that, we're going to be influenced by, then maybe we can have metrics that are tracking, that are mapping to our assumptions and external factors. And so we're going to get an early warning system, from our metric tracking if things are not unfolding the way we expected, or maybe they're unfolding better than we expected. But we're going to get that early warning, and we're going to use that as a prompt to come back and potentially reconsider our logic model, or maybe go in and reconsider our risk and take another look at our bow tie diagrams. So hopefully through that you can see how logic models can be helpful for more structured and rigorous planning around the objectives themselves, but also how they can help improve your risk management program, especially when you get into concepts like risk appetite and identifying key risk indicators. Thank you.